a new day dawning. The time is at hand where the glory of the Lord will be revealed to every man. Open the door. Open the door. Open the door. And let the King of Glory in. Open the door. Open the door, open the door, and let the King of Glory in. All right. Open up the door starts right now. So fling wide you heavenly gates and prepare the way of the risen Lord. Apostle John was on the island of Patmos. He was in prison for the testimony of Jesus Christ. And he heard a sound behind him, and he said, I looked, and there was a door standing open in heaven. And I heard a voice which was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place. That's what we need, my friends. We need a heavenly perspective. The things that are going on in the world around us, the things that the Word of God foretold us would come to pass, those things which must take place, those things which are taking place even now. That is what this broadcast is all about, discussing the issues of the day, discerning the times in which we live from a biblical perspective and world view. Greetings and salutations, everybody all across the fruited plain. What you are about to hear is the fusion of heart, mind, and soul. And I am Andy White, and I want to just greet everybody who's tuning in right now. Thanks for joining in for a brand new edition of Open Up the Doors. Hey, I am streaming live on my Open Up the Doors Facebook page over at facebook.com/FaithFM 91.7. I'm also streaming live over there on my personal page as well. I'm going to wave and say hello to the folks on my personal page. Doing some experimentation here with the different camera angles and situations with Facebook Live. But please, if you are tuned in, if you are joining in on Facebook Live, please share. Please share. Sharing is caring. It's the best way to get around the toll booths. I don't even want to call them toll booths. The barriers that Facebook keeps putting up to suppress views that they don't particularly agree with or like. So please share this. I'd appreciate it so much. If you'd like to contact me on a personal level, you can email me at ajwhite777@icloud.com. That's ajwhite777@icloud.com. If you'd like to correspond with me about anything that you just want to go beyond what the show is about, beyond what the broadcast is about, you got any questions? For those of you who are on Facebook, speaking of which questions, please shoot me some comments and some questions throughout the length of the broadcast, throughout the duration of the broadcast, and I'll try and, I want this to be interactive as much as possible. I'll address your questions or air your comments as the broadcast progresses. Anyway, let me get to it. I think I covered everything. If I didn't, well, maybe I'll remember later on in the broadcast. But I think I got all my preliminary stuff out of the way. Anyway, in last week's broadcast, I began to address the issue of socialism. And it's something that I want to be discussing for the next couple of weeks because I believe this is a very, very important issue, folks. I think it's far more important than many people even realize. And having said that, again, I want to encourage you to please share this broadcast because I do think these broadcasts are important. Socialism it's rearing its ugly head once again in America, and there are real forces trying to push it on us, propagate it, promulgate it, and I just I began last week, like I said, and if you missed last week's broadcast, it is on my YouTube channel. We need to be an informed people, folks, and that's what these broadcasts are about. We need to be an informed people as well as informing people as well, because by and large, especially the younger generation, especially the millennials, they don't even have a clue of what it is that they're advocating for. They really don't. Just the other day, I was reading, I should say, I think there was a video clip in it as well, but it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez explaining what she felt socialism was. And as I shared in last week's broadcast, socialism isn't about some amorphous feeling. It's got a definition. It's got a very, very real definition, and we can't just make it anything that we want it to be. And I began to lay that down in last week's broadcast, what socialism is according to its textbook definition, not to some euphemistic or some amorphous feeling of what people think it is, but what it actually is in regards to socialist economic theory, a system where private property is not allowed and would be abolished. A system where the private ownership of your own business would not be allowed. A system where the means of production would be owned and controlled by the state. A system that holds to the belief that wealth and property should be evenly distributed throughout society and that the government is to be the arbiter of that distribution. That is, in a nutshell, and there's more to socialism than that, but that's the backbone. That's the foundation of what it is. And for those democratic socialists who insist that what they're talking about isn't what was practiced in Soviet Russia, or wasn't what practiced in Venezuela, or isn't what's practiced, go to the website. Like I said last week, go to the Socialist Democrats of America website, and they have what their beliefs. In fact, I'll be quoting some of it as the broadcast proceeds. But they're duplicitous, folks, and that's what socialists have always done. They've always promised utopia and delivered a dystopia. But it is very important to understand, as I shared last week, just by way of review, that socialism is a stepping stone to full-fledged Marxist communism. For orthodox Marxists, socialism is regarded as the lowest stage of communism, the first rung, if you will, based on the principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his contribution. But then there's the fullest stage, the full-fledged socialist communism, which is based on the principle, which most of you have heard before, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And they understand that socialism is this transitional phase of economic theory between capitalism and communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And this is the aspect and the principle that I want to address a little bit today, because as I was sharing last week, there are, and this is what concerns me more than anything else, there are sincere Christians, sincere Bible believers who think that the Bible is socialist, who think that Christianity is socialist, who think that the early church in the book of Acts engaged in socialism. But that's a fallacy. And I'm going to go through that a little bit in this first block of this broadcast, because we read in Acts, for instance, Acts chapter 4, verse 32. Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. Well, that sounds like a socialist tenet, does it not? But it's out of context. And to assert or even suggest that what the early church practiced, and here's the key, folks, mind you, it was only for a brief time in the Jerusalem church that this communal living was practiced. Once the persecution came in to the Jerusalem church and they were scattered, you never hear about this again. But to think that this is what socialism actually is, what's being propagated today, and that's the key. That's why I went through a lot of time last week going through the definition of socialism. Because for anyone to think that what was going on in the early church in the book of Acts was socialism, it shows a complete misunderstanding, both of what the early church was practicing and what socialism actually espouses. And those who would appeal to the practice of the early church in the book of Acts, they overlook a fact, my friends. They overlook a fact that what they began to practice was completely voluntary. Completely voluntary. It was a spontaneous act of benevolence of their own volition. It was not a forced redistribution of wealth. This is a key point that we need to understand. The Bible never, ever teaches a forced redistribution of wealth, because there is a moral difference between contribution and confiscation. And I'm going to be hammering those two words home today in this broadcast, knowing the difference between a contribution and a confiscation. Because, again, it's like a priori knowledge. It should be self-evident. But you got to explain these things in detail, especially in this day and age where people try to redefine everything, of course. But to contribute of your resources voluntarily to help meet needs is indeed a moral virtue. Of course it is. However, to have your resources taken from you through compulsion and confiscation, that's theft and it's tyranny. And when a government steps in to confiscate legitimately earned income or property in order to give it to those who did not work or do not work or merely have less, that's not virtuous. That is a corruption of virtue. Folks, virtue can only reside in what is voluntary in character and choice. That's a fundamental truth. Compulsion can never be virtuous. If you do something of your own free will, it's virtuous. If you're forced to do it, it's slavery. Now, here is where the progressive Christians and the religious left go off the tracks. You know, there never seems to be a shortage of those who want to twist the scriptures to fit their ideology. I'm going to give you some examples today. Several years ago, there was an article published in the Washington Post. The Washington Post, yeah. They probably do boast a lot in Washington, don't they? No, there was an article published in the Washington Post by a Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite, who happens to be a professor at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And she wrote an article titled, "It's Not Class Warfare, It's Christianity." And Professor Thistlethwaite asserted in her article that, quote, the self-styled Christian capitalists don't ever seem to recall in the book of Acts the early disciples shared all things in common. Well, that's a false statement, and we're going to go over that right now. I'm going to take up her challenge right now, because she goes on to say, this is what the Bible actually says about the economic practice of Jesus' followers. And then she quotes from the book of Acts. I'm going to read the quote because I think it's good to read it anyway. Now the company of those who believed were of one heart and soul. And no one said that any of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had everything in common. There was not a needy person among them. For as many as were possessors of lands, plural, or houses, sold them, and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to each as any had need. Now, I got to tell you, this passage has been used and abused time and time again by the leftists as their proof text for their socialist state ever since socialist economic theory came into existence. Yet, I'm going to emphasize this because this is vitally important, what they constantly fail to grasp, either by willful ignorance or duplicity, and I think it's the latter, honestly, is the very real difference between giving freely and giving by compulsion. And they simply can't seem to grasp that basic concept, the difference between a contribution and a confiscation. Professor Thistlethwaite states in regard to the passage here in Acts, quote, this is what the Bible actually says about the economic practices of Jesus' followers. Well, no, not really, it doesn't. That's what her convoluted eisegesis would assert. But in fact, the Bible does not make that a prescription of economic philosophy at all. This passage in Acts, plain and simple, this passage in Acts simply records what a local community of believers did spontaneously as a response to the needs of its own church community, and not the populace as a whole. They weren't collecting everything and giving it to all of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I do think all churches should be benevolent to their church members. I think we would all agree to that. It is incumbent upon the church to reach out to the poor, to reach out to the widows, to reach out to the orphans, to reach out to the needy. That is a church calling. That is a church virtue. But it's always done voluntarily by the church members, never as a mandated economic system, which is what these socialists try to do. And I'm going to say it again. The passage in Acts simply records what a local community of believers did spontaneously as a response to the needs of its own church community. And it cannot, folks, it cannot be emphasized enough. It was not ordered to be done. It was not commanded to be done by the apostles. It was not mandated. Now, someone commented on my article the other day. I wrote a new article this past week, which is up on the Open Up the Doors Facebook page. The false gospel, the false gospel of the socialist religious left. And someone commented on my article, and they were refuting me by saying, even though I was saying that what the early church did there was not mandated, this particular brother's refutation to me was this. He said, we are mandated to love. Well, yes. Yes, we are. But love doesn't mean we give away free stuff unequivocally. It's like, hello? In fact, sometimes love means withholding something from someone so as not to allow them to get away with being irresponsible. You see, it's so easy to say, oh, well, love just gives and gives and gives. But love gives what is needed for the situation. That's what love does. Love seeks to help your neighbor. And that help sometimes may need to come in the form of not helping them. Not being an enabler of irresponsibility and entitlement mentality. When you enable someone and you help them by enabling them to continue, for instance, doing drugs, you're not helping them. When you help somebody by constantly giving them money and food, though they refuse to work, and they're able to work, mind you, we are not talking about legitimately poor people who can't work, who are sick or maimed or disabled. We're not talking about that. Because that, even socialism doesn't talk about that. Socialism talks about a societal egalitarianism. That's why you see some cities and some counties and states around the country trying to give everybody a minimum living wage, just free money. That's what socialism leads to. This false egalitarianism. But being an enabler of irresponsibility and entitlement is not loving your neighbor. Yes, we are mandated to love, but love doesn't mean you just give out free stuff willy-nilly, my friends. Sorry, it just doesn't. But getting back to the article here, Professor Thistlethwaite sarcastically said, the self-styled Christian capitalists, very sarcastic, don't ever seem to recall in the book of Acts the early disciples shared all things common. Well, I just recalled it, and I just answered it. But I have another question for her. I asked her, does she recall another passage? Because the things in Acts, as I said, weren't commanded or demanded or mandated. It was spontaneous benevolence, which we applaud. But here's another command. That actually is an economic practice. Because, it's funny how Miss Thistlethwaite asserted that the Acts passage was, quote, this is what the Bible actually says about the economic practices of Jesus' followers. No, it doesn't. But I will give you what Paul did give as a command about the economic practices. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul said, but we command you, brethren. That's a mandate. We command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly, irresponsible, disorderly. Withdraw from them, withhold from them, not just freely give them willy-nilly. Paul says, for you know yourselves, verse 7 of 2 Thessalonians 3, for you know yourselves how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you. And here's key. Nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this. If anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. Folks, the Bible is perfectly imbalanced. It is in a perfect balance with each other. There are biblical principles that balance each other out. We ought to help the indigent poor. We ought to help those who are weak. Of course we are. But nowhere in the Bible does it talk about an egalitarianism that socialism is based upon. It's right here. If you don't work, you don't eat. So, Miss Thistlewhite, do you ever think about remembering this scripture? See, this in fact, in this passage in Acts, is about an economic practice of the early church, a Christian work ethic, a biblical worth ethic. Paul actually does state his economic practice. He worked to raise money for his own support and ministry. In fact, he owned his own business, something that is not allowed in Marxist socialism. Paul was a tent maker. And in numerous places in the New Testament, he talks about how he labored with his hands. He writes how he labored with his hands to make money, and to make money at a profit. Because if you don't make money at a profit, and all you make money for is to sustain yourself, you have no money to give to the poor. Hello, it's common sense. But Paul labored with his own hands to make money to use as he saw fit for his ministry. Not some central planning system. The church in Jerusalem didn't own and control or distribute Paul's business or means of production. See, I'm sticking to the script as far as what socialism is. These are the things they don't want to tell you. They want to point to Acts 6, which was a brief, spontaneous thing in a localized church, and never talk about the full principles and the full precepts of the Word of God. Again, it's called the Christian work ethic. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, "Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him," what? Labor. We were created, God created us to be, he said, be fruitful and multiply. That didn't just mean the act of procreation. He created us in his image and likeness. God built things. He built the universe. He built everything. As you know, I'm playing with it a little bit here. But God, he put the ability to create in man, to work. Jesus said, "My Father is working even now, and I am working." He created us to labor, to work, to be fruitful, to be productive, and to do that to earn not just your most basic needs. What does Paul say? Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. You see, those who espouse this Christian socialism think that capitalists are greedy and we're just full of avarice, and that we don't want to help the poor. It's a lie. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because, again, looking at the full scope of Scripture, we know that we are to help the poor. But it's to be an individualistic thing because it's a moral virtue. It's Christian character. You cannot have the government do it. Really, you want the government to do it? They do a great job at everything, don't they? They really do a great job at everything, don't they? Okay, I'm going to say it again. To help and support the weak, to help the indigenous poor is a moral virtue that we're called to do as individuals. To enable the slothful is not. To give and contribute freely from your own resources to help the legitimately needy is called benevolence. But to mandate, hear me folks, to mandate an egalitarian redistribution of wealth by way of the confiscation of resources through the power of the state is not benevolence, it's malevolence. And that is not what the church did in the book of Acts. As a Christian, I absolutely believe in, and in fact engage in, charitable giving. However, confiscatory taxation for government largesse is not sharing. That's not sharing, folks. It's stealing. I'm going to do one more quote before I go to a break from Susan Brooks' article. It's not class warfare, it's Christianity. Because her article is pure sophistry. She goes on to say, quote, Americans sharing more equally in the burden of pulling our country out of massive debt. A lot of that massive debt is because of government waste, government spending that shouldn't be spent on things, entitlement programs for people who don't deserve it. I'm going down a bunny trail, but this is what she's saying here. Listen to what she says. Americans sharing more equally in the burden of pulling our country out of massive debt and using tax revenue to stimulate the economy and create jobs isn't class warfare. It's not the government's business to create jobs. It's my boss's business to create jobs. And when you overburden him with taxes and regulations and all kinds of fees and more taxes on top of that, and he's got no money for your taxation system, and he's got no money left in the business to hire somebody, you're taking away from him his responsibility, your boss's responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility to create jobs using taxpayer money. It's the business owners. It's the entrepreneurs' responsibility. But she says this is just sweet what she says here. Using tax revenue to stimulate the economy and create jobs isn't class warfare. Here's the kicker. Quote, it's actually Christianity. What? I'm sorry, folks. I can't seem to find that chapter in my Bible. Why is it when a Bible believing Christian quotes the Bible, when Bible believing Christians want to refer to their faith in the discourse of public policy, we're called theocrats. We're even called haters. But when a leftist quotes the Bible and misquotes it and misapplies it, when they appeal to Jesus, they're called compassionate and caring. It's the conundrum, the question of all ages, I think. But I'm going to take a break, folk. I'll be back to pontificate and bloviate some more. But here's Sanctus Real, Keep My Heart Alive. Stick around. I'll be back in a moment. Sanctus Real, Keep My Heart Alive. You are listening to Open Up the Doors here on Faith FM, the fusion of heart, mind, and soul. WEGB 90.7 and 93.3 in Nepegue. WEGQ 91.7 in Quag. Yes, Jesus, keep our hearts alive. One of the things I was sharing with the folks on Facebook Live while the song was playing and I was off air was, when we're dealing with these issues that we're dealing with, these cultural war issues and things like socialism and some of the all this lawlessness that we're seeing going on in the world around us. Like Jesus said in the last days, that because lawlessness would increase, the love of many would grow cold. And that's why I felt like I wanted to play that song, because we're dealing with some serious stuff here, and sometimes you can just get overwhelmed and exasperated with it. But it's always about coming back to our good shepherd, coming back to him who is that balm of Gilead, him who will keep our heart alive, because he maketh us lie down in green pastures, and he restores our soul. And that's always the key to our Christian walk, to our relationship with the Lord. But I want to get back on topic here right now with this, because I've got some more examples of what I've been discussing here about how specifically and particularly the religious left likes to take Acts chapter 6 and the early church of Acts out of context and turn it into something that it really wasn't. Because despite all the rhetoric and all of their emotional assertions that the liberal left and the socialists give you, I want to say it plain out. The gospel, my friends, isn't a socialist manifesto. And the early church did not practice socialism. Certainly not as defined by Karl Marx and today's democratic socialists. In fact, honestly, and this is God's honest truth, when you actually analyze it, Marxism is the corruption of Jesus' teachings and the early church's practice. It's a heresy and a false gospel. It's taking God out of the picture, ultimately. Marx was a humanist. He was an atheist. And he replaced God with the state. And that's where socialism ends up. Remember, the goal of socialism as a transitionary stage is communism. And communism is always about the sovereignty of the state. There is no God. The state is now the all-supreme sovereign. Socialism is what you get when you remove God, when you remove the Holy Spirit, and you want to turn Christian virtue and morality into an egalitarianism. Christian virtue and morality, you take it out of the question of benevolent giving. And there is, and I'm going to keep saying it, there is a fundamental distinction that is essential and crucial to understand. It is the distinction between giving as a voluntary contribution or a confiscation by compulsion. Contribution or confiscation. It's as simple as that. And I want to reference yet another fallacious attempt at defining Christianity as socialist. This is a more recent article that was in Patheos. I referenced it last week as well in last week's broadcast. This article in Patheos by this guy, Chuck McKnight, titled, Jesus Was a Socialist. The author makes his appeal to the Acts Church as well, but it's quite revealing what he admits to. Quote from his article, "It's not uncommon to hear people claim that the early church practiced a form of socialism. You're right, and that's why I'm refuting it. After all, the book of Acts does seem to describe something along those lines. But Christians of a capitalist bent tend to brush this aside with a stock response. Stock response because it's true. The stock response is what I shared with you in the first block. That it was spontaneous, that it was voluntary, and that it wasn't mandated. That's the stock response that he's referring to, because the stock response is the proper exegesis of the passage. And he admits it. We'll go on in his quoting from his article. Quote, "The book of Acts," they point out, "is descriptive rather than prescriptive. That is, these early believers acted voluntarily, and Acts merely records what they did. But the book stops short of actually instructing other believers to follow their example. Fair enough," he says, quote, "On a technicality, they are correct." Thank you very much. Bravo. On a technicality. He should have ended his article right there, my friends. Case closed. But of course he didn't end his article there. On a technicality, they're correct. And then he goes on to build his buts. But this, but that. See, when it comes to proper biblical exegesis, the correct technicality settles the issue. When you go beyond being technically correct, you then construct an ideology and a doctrine built upon eisegesis and not sound exegesis. And McKnight, in a similar fashion to the Susan Thistlethwaite article, writes, "If we work together as a nation, we do have the resources to eradicate poverty." I'd like to answer that right there, but I can't digress. He says this: there's enough to go around for everyone. Not with what they want to do. Free education, free health care, free everything. You could take, it's called math. You could take all of the money of all of the billionaires and everybody and still not be able to pay for their socialist programs. But they never seem to understand that. So even that statement, there's enough to go around for everybody, it's absurd. But let me continue to quote McKnight. And listen very carefully. The only reason this hasn't happened yet, in other words, that we can eradicate poverty, according to McKnight, the only reason this hasn't happened is that we as a nation have allowed individuals to amass excessive wealth and thus hoard what should be communal resources: land, shelter, food, etc. This is in a Christian magazine. This is in a Christian website. We have allowed individuals to amass. So what are you suggesting there? We have allowed. What are you suggesting? We take it from them. We confiscate it from them because someone did well in his job, in his business, and he gained a lot of money. He gained a lot of profit. We've allowed that. You see where they're going with this? What should be communal resources. Well, who's the arbiter of what communal resources is? Land, shelter, food. Shelter. Oh, so you want to take my house. Everyone should have the same house or no house. Listen, I did several missions trips to the former Soviet Union right after the Soviet Union fell. And I went into the public housing. And everyone that lived in these public housing, these tenement buildings, they all looked exactly the same. Every apartment, every piece of furniture, because it was all government supplied. It wasn't owned by the people. They didn't own their couch. This is true, folks. I stayed with people in the Ukraine right after the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't own their china closet. They didn't own their couch. They didn't own their nightstands. It was all part of the apartment, which was owned by the government, and everyone had the same exact thing. It destroys the human soul. Hello. I'm going to get to that if I have time in the next block. Not only does socialism destroy the economy, it destroys the human soul. We have allowed individuals to amass wealth. There is so much that is simply wrong with that statement. But the short of this assertion is that it's Marxism, pure and simple. And yet every single time they say, oh no, we don't believe in Marxism. But then everything they espouse is Marxism. If we work together as a nation, he says. Notice how it went from the early church and community of faith, which I'm all for. The practice that was ostensibly based upon kingdom principles, which I'm all for. Notice the subtle shift. If we work together as a nation, national policies. Because this is what we're talking about, folks. When we're talking about socialism as an economic system and as a form of government, this is what we're talking about, national policies. Now, aren't these the same folks who are always pontificating to us about separation of church and state? I mean, if they want to be consistent about their quote-unquote separation of church and state mantra, then please do not use the power of the state to implement a forced income redistribution under the banner of Christianity. Because that's what socialism is. It's an attempt to derive from the political sphere the direction and purpose of human life that is the province of morality and culture and the church. In other words, it's legislating morality. Something that for decades the secular left and the liberals told us we weren't supposed to do. We're supposed to trust the government to be the arbiter of benevolence and charity. And yet it's their policies. It's their very policies of tax and spend, along with their waste and fraud and inefficiencies that have done more harm than good to the plight of the poor and needy. And that is more than demonstrable. Looking at the clock here, I'm going to try and squeeze in a whole bunch before I go to my next break. The whole trajectory of what I'm getting at, and I think you're understanding, is a difference between freely giving and you having control of your benevolence and you having control of your charity, which is biblical, and the government taking it from you and dictating it. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 9:7, speaking to the church in Corinth, he says, let each one give just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The very context of the verse in 2 Corinthians is precisely for the collecting of funds for the poor of another church. But he makes an appeal. He doesn't say we're going to come there and we're going to hold you guys upside down and shake you so all your change falls out of your pockets. The Bible never teaches benevolence by means of compulsion. The very idea is an oxymoron. Folks, it is precisely because of America's Judeo-Christian roots that we are the most generous and responsive nation of people on the face of the earth. When tragedy and need strikes here at home and around the globe, we Americans are second to none in freely giving. It's not a question of helping the poor and those in need. We have that in our DNA as Christians and as Americans. That's not the issue. That's a leftist straw man. You don't care about the poor. No, that's a lie. It is their insistence that the government should be the arbiter of both my resources and my Christian virtue that is the issue. My resources are under my control, and if I would choose to give to the Salvation Army or to Samaritan's Purse or to missionaries on the field that are doing hands-on work with the poor of another nation, that is what I want to do. The government can't does it, never does it. Well, they try to do it, and I don't even have the time to get into all of the scandals and the abuse by organizations such as the Red Cross and others, government agencies, USAID, and the amount of money that gets lost. I don't have time to get into all of that. They want us to trust the government to be the arbiter of charity and benevolence. It's laughable on its face, my friends. But I'm going to take a break. I'll be back in a minute. Stick around. He is Lincoln Brewster. Love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Stick around, folks. I'll be right back. Fusion of heart, mind, and soul. You are listening to Open Up the Doors with Andy right here on Faith FM, WEGB 90.7 and 93.3 in that peak, and WEGQ 91.7 in Quad. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, all across the fruited plain and all around the spherical globe. I am also streaming live, if you're just joining in, on my Open Up the Doors Facebook page at www.facebook.com/faithfm 91.7. If you want to join in the conversation over there on Facebook, and people are joining in the conversation. And someone asked a question that I kind of mentioned it in passing last week. Well, I alluded to what the Soviets did during the Bolshevik Revolution that brought on the Ukrainian famine and the Ukrainian. The estimates go anywhere from 3 million to 7 million Ukrainians died. Someone on Facebook asked, what happens if socialism takes over, and what happens to the home that you already own? Well, they take it. I doubt it would get that far here in America. I think that would certainly be an absolute real civil war. I don't think it would ever get that far in America. But the bottom line is this: the Bolsheviks took the farms and the homes away from the Ukrainian farmers. And then the government began to oversee and control the means of production, which brought on a mass starvation for millions of people. But basically, when they come in to that degree of dictatorship, when socialism blows out into full-fledged communism, they will take your homes. Oh, one of my favorite. You reminded me of something. One of my all-time favorite movies on a lot of levels. It really, literally is one of my favorite all-time movies, Fiddler on the Roof, because it's just an awesome movie. It's so emotional. I've seen that movie dozens of times, and I still cry when I watch it. But it's about the Bolshevik Revolution. It's about Tavier's relationship, a Soviet Jew. The movie is filled with Judaism. It's filled with the politics of the day, the Bolshevik Revolution. It's filled with this Jewish man's relationship with God, on the one hand. But on the other hand, this is a great movie. And the reason I'm going down that memory lane with Fiddler on the Roof, because that's exactly what happens in the movie. People that knew Tavier's family, that he knew from a little boy, joined the Bolshevik Revolution. And a friend of his, a Gentile friend of his, came, an old man, his same age, comes because they're being told they have to leave their home. They're being pushed out from their homes. It's a heartbreaking scene. Tavier just looks at his friend that he's been friends with his entire life and goes, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And the guy just puts his head down and he goes, "I'm just following orders. I'm just following orders." Because the Soviets came in, the Bolsheviks came in. Vladimir Lenin Socialism is the goal to communism. The communist Bolshevik revolution. They came and they took their homes. I know I went down a bunny trail with the question, but it's a good question. Will that ever happen in America? I sincerely hope not. I don't believe it. I don't believe it could. Not without completely having a Bolshevik type revolution. Because we have a constitution and we have freedom and liberty and capitalism in our DNA. The socialists they want to try and make us kind of like what they call the European style socialism, which it really isn't. That what they point to over there in Scandinavia, what Bernie Sanders has always pointed to over there in Scandinavia, it's not really socialism. What gives them their prosperity is a free market capitalist society. What they have is a bloated welfare state, and that's what these democratic socialists are always pointing to. I'm probably going to get into that a little bit next week, as a matter of fact, because even that's a complete myth. But I'm running out of time here, and somebody else said, hallelujah. My wife commented on Facebook, "You're making it sound like we're always watching movies." Well, I am 62 years old. I've seen a lot of different movies. And the movies I reference always have, I think, a real impact because, the type of movies I like are kind of historically based or spiritually based. But now I'm really rambling. I said something that I really want to get into. And whenever I don't finish up this week, I'm going to continue on with next week. But I made a statement, and it really goes back to even this movie, Fiddler on the Roof, about the Bolshevik Revolution and the effect it had on the Jewish community in Russia at the time, Ukraine at the time. But not only does, as I said a moment ago, not only does socialism destroy the economy because it doesn't abide by the laws of economics, it destroys the human soul as well because it ignores human nature. Why work harder if others will give me what I need? Why should I be more industrious if the government is going to take it away from me anyway? The Pilgrims tried this, my friends. The Pilgrims tried an experiment with socialism, and they starved for 2 years. And I was going to get into some stuff, but I'm running out of time, about what William Brannan said in The History of Plymouth Plantation. Let me give you one quote. The communal lifestyle, according to William Bradford in his book, History of Plymouth Plantation, when they tried the socialist system. Here's a quote. He said, this communal living found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine. In other words, they moaned that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without recompense. The experiment with socialism in the Plymouth Plantation was a disaster. They starved to death. And it wasn't until 1624 that Bradford abandoned socialism, and they gave everyone a plot of land to farm it for themselves. And all of a sudden, people that didn't work were now working. And then the following year, and I'm just condensing this because I'm running out of time. I'm just absolutely condensing this. But they went from starvation to, once they got rid of the socialist system and everyone started farming, they produced 3 times the amount of corn that they did under the socialist system, and they began to be industrious, and they began to prosper, and they basically did away with socialism. I'm looking at the clock. I want to squeeze this in. I want to squeeze this in from the Democratic Socialist of America website. The Democratic Socialists of America that AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders are all part of. It says this on their website, question, in their frequently asked questions section. Won't socialism be impractical because people will lose their incentive to work? They're asking the question because they know it's already been demonstrated that it's true. But listen to the ridiculous answer. We don't agree with the capitalist assumption that starvation or greed are the only reasons people work. It's not an assumption. We've already seen it happen. It happened with the Pilgrims. They starved to death unless they farmed their own land. They go on to say, people enjoy their work if it is meaningful and enhances their lives. Well, only if you have the freedom to choose your work. When I was in the Ukraine and I was with the people there, they told us under their former Soviet system, they were told who was going to be a doctor, who was going to be a teacher, who was going to be a street cleaner, who was going to be a bus driver. They weren't free to choose what they wanted to be. The Soviet system told them what they were going to be. These people enjoy work if it is meaningful and enhances their lives. They work out of a sense of responsibility to their community and society. No, they don't. It's against fallen human nature. They are denying fallen human nature. Not only fallen human nature to begin with. God designed us to be productive, to be fruitful. Liberty is the law of our nature. I'm running out of time. I don't have time to get through this whole thing here from quoting the Democratic Socialists of America website, but they said something that it just blew my mind. Although a long-term goal of socialism is to eliminate all but the most enjoyable kinds of labor. Okay, really? You're going to eliminate all but the most enjoyable kinds of labor? I don't know if people actually like being cesspool pumpers. You know, the people that clean out your cesspool. I don't think they enjoy that, but it's a needed job. It's a needed job, and people do it because they make money at it because somebody's got to do it. But according to the Socialist Democrats of America, they will get rid of these jobs that people don't enjoy doing. In other words, they're going to do what I told you they did in the former Soviet Union. They will assign people jobs. They go on, these tasks would be, listen to this, these tasks would be spread among as many people as possible rather than distributed on the basis of class, race, ethnicity, or gender as they are under capitalism. They're not distributed under capitalism. People choose what they want to work. And now they're saying these tasks will be distributed. This is what AOC and her squad are talking about, folks. Go to the Democrat Socialists of America website, and you will see it. I am completely and utterly out of time, and I've got to run. But I'm going to pick this all up again next week. I'll open up the doors. But note this, socialism violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. Period. It's failed time and time again. And I'll get back to this next week. Keep it right here on Faith FM.